Well, this is a new podcast. We have Tartan Truths with Peter MacDonald, and this is our inaugural episode. And we're glad to have with us the man himself, the historian of Tartan. Peter MacDonald, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
So this week we're going to be talking about Tartan myths, and it's something that happens a lot. Scotland's known for their myths, but particularly there's a lot of myths with regards to Tartan, and certainly you're well aware of that. But first, we thought we'd talk about sort of what's been happening with you. Saw this past week that you were giving a talk recently, and you noted something about a pretty cool eBay find. Mind telling us about that?
No, I guess it's probably a couple of years ago now that a friend of mine who's a male costume collector alerted me to a piece on eBay and said, "Oh, you might be interested in this." He knew of my interest in tartan. And it was a piece that was described as of Dickensian or Edwardian interest, simply as that. And it was quite clearly a tartan cloak. I took one look at it and recognized it for what it was, which was a piece of, or a cloak in Wilson's of Bannockburn's cloth. They were the great tartan weavers of the late 18th, early 19th century. So this piece, I reckon, was probably 1820, 1830, something like that. In one of their designs, which they called pattern number 43, Kid or Caledonia, now adopted in the about 1816 by the Macphersons, and still the Macpherson tartan today. And so, I reached out, as you would say in America, and purchased this thing. And I think the seller had no idea what they really had. And this is not the first time that I've come across things that are misunderstood, particularly if they've been altered in some way. A friend of mine, in fact, the friend who alerted me to this, picked up a complete 1822 outfit which had been used in the theatre and, didn't know what they had. I was very jealous about that one. But yeah, a great find.
So, are you regularly perusing eBay for these types of things? What's your search look like? What are you looking for when you're doing these? I know your
Oh,
friend
it's
tipped you
exciting.
off
I
on
don't
this
want
one,
to
but
share that. Someone else might find them. But yes, I regularly look at eBay and various other sites, Etsy, etc. And it's just, I guess, it's good luck and good fortune to come across things like this. The end of last year, I also came across, in fact, someone had posted on Facebook a sporran, and I took one look at this sporran and thought, I've got to have that, and bought it, if like out from anywhere. And it was a horsehair sporran with a silver cantle, but on the cantle was the royal arms of Britain, and this was a sporran probably about 1850 that was made for one of so either who later became Edward the Seventh, or one of his brothers, worn, made for and worn at their sister's wedding in 1852. And there is a picture, a painting showing them wearing it. And again, just took one look at that and thought, there can only be one, only one left. So these things come up from time to time. Complete items like this are rare, and it's normally fragments that I'm looking for, looking at, buying, etc.
sure. So, have you posted a picture of that sporran before?
I can't remember whether I have. It's something I need to do when I
Yeah.
get around to it.
I think you should. That sounds amazing. That's incredible. What a find. Well, that's exciting. Let's get into our topic this week then. Uh, Myths with regards to Tartan. And no doubt, Scotland's known for Nessie and all these different things. With regards to Tartan, there's so many actually. It's kind of fascinating if you just really think about the myths that are out there. Just ideas people maybe have heard, they pass it down. Um, some of the ones that you and I, as we were kind of prepping for this, we're talking about is one with regards to Tartan being maybe like just exclusively Scottish. And Scotland is certainly known for that. I mean, that's your career almost 40 years of tartan research and all things Highland wear. But who really is who can really take the feather in the cap, so to speak, for being first with tartan, would you say?
Well, the simple answer to that is we don't know because obviously we can only work with what's survived and passed down to us. The first thing to do to understand is that tartan as a cloth is a fairly simple structure. So it's no different from blue jeans. It's a very strong structure. It's what's called a staggered two-two twill. And in terms of a decorative pattern, it's quite boring. If you think of blue jeans, it's just a plain cloth. So in order to make it interesting, you add color to it, and you can either make it one color or you can add stripes in it.
Hmm.
But you can only make it striped. You can't make circles or anything else because to do that would actually break up the structure of the cloth. So that's the structure of cloth. It's a fairly simple weaving process in that respect, and therefore it's not unique to Scotland in terms of a form of invention. The oldest surviving piece we have dates to about 1200 BC and comes from an area of what is now China, the Tarim Basin on the edge of Mongolia. And the reason that that piece has survived, or several of those pieces have survived, is because the climatic conditions, the burial conditions there are such that the textiles survive. In Britain, the nature of our soil is such that burials, clothing does not survive very long, unless you're very lucky and something's preserved in an anhydrous environment in a bog or something like that. And so the oldest piece that we have in Scotland of what I would describe as a true tartan has been dated to the 16th century, so between 1500 and 1600. But again, that's a very, very rare example. On most of the old pieces that we have, you can't find a piece really predating 1700, with one exception.
And the one exception being,
The so-called Glenafric tartan, which was this piece that was exposed during some forestry work. Glenafric is west of Inverness, and it's a piece, I guess, about A3 in British terms, so sort of a large foolscap plus piece that was dug up, exposed, and handed in. And it was carbon dated a couple of years ago, and as I say, carbon dated to between 1500 and 1600. So fairly reliable. And that is an exceptional and unusual survivor in Scotland.
yeah. So what would you say? Have you ever had a chance to examine or look at the Tartan Basin's the tartan that's from that region, supposedly what they have?
Only by through photographs, and actually discussing it with the author of probably the best book on it, an American lady called Dr. Wayland Barber, and she and I were both lecturing at a conference. Gosh, must be 20 years ago, and so she and I were talking about some of the intricacies of the pattern. But in terms of its structure, it's woven, spun and woven in the same way as tartan in Scotland is done. Similar to, there's one piece that survives in a burial in Denmark called known as the Holdemose outfit. Similar structure, and some pieces from a salt mine in Austria from the 8th century.
Fascinating.
A few pieces survive, but as I say, they are unusual survivors, either because the conditions don't allow survival or because people use things until they fell apart. So the idea that people had lots of clothing and they just kept spare pieces, that wasn't the reality in past times.
Right. So is this something that you get asked a lot? Do people reach out to you and say, "Hey, tell me the story of tartan. Why is it originally from Scotland?" Is that what
Yeah,
does that happen?
oh, it does. And so the talk I was giving earlier this week, that's if you like the preface for how we lead into it, the history of tartan, because people do assume that it is wholly Scottish. And so, explaining to them that it's not, that structurally it's a very, as I say, a simple pattern, and therefore it doesn't take, one particular culture to have invented this, a bit like the wheel. And,
Right.
it's the one shape for a wheel, and it wasn't invented only by one group, I suspect. And the difference is that only in Scotland did tartan become, if you like, a culturally identifiable symbol, and a lot of that had to do with the last Jacobite rising
Hmm.
and Prince Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, adopting it as a uniform and unifying symbol of the Jacobites. And so
Right.
that's really what codified it in Scotland to the way that we understand it today.
Yeah. Maybe they did it the best too, right? I mean, it's
Well,
almost like
yeah, and we continue to produce it and refine it well into the 18th century. So it reached if you like, a zenith in terms of production, design, etc., that it did nowhere else in the world.
yeah. the Irish made whiskey, but the Scots made it drinkable. Was that kind of the
Something like that.
Very good. Well, so I mean, you mentioned there with regards to the Jacobites, that kind of leads into our next myth with regards to what happened sort of after the 45. What is typically the thought after Bonnie Prince Charlie's
So
sad failure?
if you like, that's the source of the biggest myth, the one that I have most arguments with people about, and you see it repeated more often probably than anything else, is that tartan was banned after Culloden,
Yeah,
based on a misunderstanding or misreading of the so-called Dress Act of 1746. The same source that people say also banned bagpipes and Gaelic. None of those were banned. In terms of tartan, there is a clause in the Act, which is actually the third of a series of acts that goes right back to the 15, but it introduced a dress element, and the dress forbade the wearing of Highland clothes by men in the Highlands, and the Highlands had been defined by the first Act of 1715. And it talked about the clothes you couldn't wear. And so it talked about the plaid, trews, jackets, etc., and coats of tartan or party coloured cloth, greatcoats, I should say. And that was, if you like, think of a trench coat type thing. It was a particular style of coat that was worn not really by Highlanders, but other, general European peoples. And I suspect that that was, if you like, a catch-all element to include other Jacobites, non-Scots, non-Highland Jacobites, who might have adopted some form of tartan garment
right.
as part of their Jacobite uniform, for want of a better word. But it doesn't refer to that. And anyone who reads the Act will, it refers to no man or boy in that part of North Britain called Scotland. So anyone will instantly or should instantly pick up that it doesn't include women, first off. There was an exception for anyone in the military, in the army. So there's two groups straight away who weren't included. So if
Right.
they're not included, how can tartan have been banned? And so people said, "Oh well, it was banned for Jacobites." Well, actually, it was banned for everybody in the civilian grouping in the Highlands, as I say, except those groups, and also, in fact, gentry were accepted or exempted, should I say, because the original act was a disarming act. Gentry were excluded from that because if you own property, you had to have the ability to protect it. And so they were excluded, as were anybody who worked for them as a form of henchman in order to help protect their property. And those same exceptions then applied to the dress element of the third act. So gentry were also included. So effectively, it only affected the middle class and poorer people, as is always the case.
Right. Wow, that's
And when
fascinating.
you then get around to the Act of Repeal in 1782, tartan's not mentioned at all. It just says, rejoice, rejoice, you can now put on all the traditional Highland clothes and you're no longer bound to the unmanly clothes of the Lowlander.
Wow. So why do you think this myth sort of got big? What is it? What is it about this story of repression that has got so many people excited
Well, I
about?
think and I've managed to trace where it comes from, and it comes from a book published in 1960, and it's actually an addendum to that book, an annex to that book, which is talking about dyestuffs, and it's written by someone else who's then, if you like, a co-author in this book, and it mentions in there that tartan was banned. So that's the first reference we have to it. If you go back to the 19th century or the 18th century, no mention of banning tartan, only about the clothing. And I think it just hit a point in time where there was a resurgence in interest. It was a very influential and popular book, a book called The History of Highland Dress, which is probably still the best book, historical book published on tartan and Highland dress. And so it was hugely influential and it was just picked up by people. And then, of course, the internet, great as it is a great way for then pro promoting inaccuracies in so many things.
True. Yeah. So basically, at that point, then we can just be clear. We're not a bagpipe podcast, but bagpipes weren't banned.
Nope.
Gaelic wasn't banned.
Nope.
and tartan was not fully banned. Just
Tartan was never banned. Only tartan overcoats were, for want of a better word.
right.
And it's very interesting when you read the soldiers who were to implement the act in the Highlands. They were writing. There are examples of them writing to the local sheriff, the local judge, and saying, "Okay, so what exactly is included in this, and does it mean this or does it mean that?" And again, they're talking about which bits of clothing, not about tartan per se.
Interesting. So there's a myth. Myth busted right here.
Probably the greatest tartan myth there is.
Glad we could settle that. It took less than 5 minutes and you have stamped it out. Very good. Another myth that kind of follows right off of that one is with regards to sort of the reintroduction of tartan that was never repressed.
Hmm.
And that's the Victorian era being responsible sort of for clan tartans, right?
Yep. Yeah, so it's again something that you'll often see written or see quoted online is, oh, the Victorians invented modern tartans. They may have certainly popularized them, but the concept of clan tartans per se arose in 1815 and arose from the Highland Society of London, which, despite its name, was an organization uh, set up by and run for clan chiefs who all had London properties because they were either in business or they were members of parliament or something like that. And it was so they were set up in 1780, and their principal aim was the repeal of the Dress Act. But as having been successful in that, they then looked at helping to preserve Highland culture, which they were very cognizant at the time was becoming diluted because people were leaving the Highlands for work, etc. So they set about trying to preserve the language, the music, piping, etc., and also the banners and everything else associated with the clans. And the secretary at the time, who was actually a miniaturist painter, suggested that they preserve the tartan, the traditional tartans of the clans as well. And they thought, oh, this is a great idea. So they wrote to all the chiefs and said, could you use the, and we're talking Highland chiefs only at this time, and
Yeah.
said, please send us a piece of your traditional family tartan, and we'll keep it in our archives. Six of the chiefs sent back the same piece of tartan,
Oh,
which
wow.
was the Black Watch tartan, because they had
Which
all served in the regiment.
which was what tartan?
The Black Watch tartan,
Black Watch.
because they'd all served in some regiment that used it, and most of the
Sure.
regiments did. Five of them were told to show again, I might add. And you have other instances. So that's where the Macpherson chief selected Wilson's pattern number 43 as his tartan. The McLaren chief selected a pattern that was previously known as Regent
Hmm.
as their tartan. And so you start to see this adoption of uniform named tartans. As I say, at that time it was only the Highland clans, but very shortly thereafter, principally through a book published in 1842 by the Sobieski Stewart, we start to see the lowland families, the Humes, the Douglases, the Hamiltons, etc., adopting tartan as well. One might say they were given tartans
Hmm.
by the Sobieski Stewart brothers. And so we see that period. So if we're talking about clan tartans, it's really a Georgian invention, George III stroke, the Prince Regent, that period, but certainly popularized by the Victorians and Queen Victoria, who, them having bought Balmoral, they liked everything to do with the Highlands, and certainly there was a great upsurge during the Victorian period. The first book published about tartans, the first of many, there were several during that period, mass production and the adoption of tartan as a pan-Scottish cultural identity symbol, if you like. And that's not just Victorian, that goes right back to George IV's visit in 1822, where Sir Walter Scott orchestrated everything and urged everyone to turn out in their clan or in tartan.
Yeah. And that's where you hear a lot of those stories, sort of similar to what you said with regards to sort of getting that specific tartan to the Victorian government with regards to like, this is our tartan, send it to us. they get five, and I guess that's the story that often goes with regards to Walter Scott's visit, right? Chiefs writing in
Indeed.
to the tartan makers and or the kill makers and saying, what's our tartan? Send us our tartan or whatever it is.
There was certainly there must have been some of that. That said, the visit of George IV was organised in about 6 or 8 weeks, so
Yeah,
that's not a huge time frame. So I think they will have most people will have gone, will either have had some already, or
sure.
if you were general public, they'd have just gone to the local store, as it were, the main weavers, and said, "What have you got in tartan?" And they would have worn whatever they liked. At that same period, Sir Wilson's of Bannockburn, who were the greatest of the weavers, tartan weavers at the time, were producing a whole load of patterns simply by number, or
Mm,
they would give them names to help them sell better. So a classic one would be their pattern number 99, which they then called Rob Roy, because Sir Walter Scott had just published his book called Rob Roy. Everybody wanted it, so Wilson thought, oh, well, let's call this tartan Rob Roy because it'll help it sell. Um, whilst it's an old pattern and had been worn by the McGregors and others, it was Wilson's who gave it that name. They similarly did a Waterloo tartan, a Wellington tartan, a George IV tartan, a Sir Walter Scott tartan,
yeah.
yada, 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 because it helped sell better.
Yes.
And you also see that they were very conscious of fashion trends. So there are something like 10,000, 20,000 letters of correspondence to them from this period that survive. And looking at them, you can see people writing, merchants writing to them and saying, "Oh, can you send me some more of this tartan? But can you put some brown in it? Because it's very popular color this year."
Hmm.
And so they were reaching out not only to the, let's call it the clan market, but also with an astute eye on the fashion market, which was undoubtedly bigger.
Right. Yeah.
That went all over the world, North America particularly, but into South America, later into Australasia, certainly into Paris, they were selling fashion tartans.
So you would say then that the Victorian era, or the Victorian, so to speak, they didn't really invent this idea, maybe it's the Georgian era, but certainly the Victorian era helped to sort of reestablish or reinvent this
They popularized
culture,
it.
popularize
Yeah,
it.
yeah, absolutely. And you see, particularly, I mean, the regiments in the 19th, sorry, the 18th century had done a lot to keep tartan and Highland dress alive, particularly, in the campaigns in North America. But then during the Victorian era, the Highland troops at Crimea certainly, were um, symbolic in their appearance, etc. And you had various Highland regiments then adopted and their uniforms captured and copied, and tartan certainly being picked up again by the civilian population. And at the same time, you have, so I say 1842 was the first book ever published that had tartan pictures, plates in it.
Yeah.
Then there were two in 1850, another one in 1870, one in 1880. And so you start to see the start of what we would know, if you went any bookshop nowadays, you'd see many pictures, books on tartan, but that was the start of that trend. So not only was it that they were popularizing it, it also coincided with the production of publications about tartan and clan history, etc. So that period during the Victorian era popularized everything.
Yeah. Excellent. So we'll have to talk. Maybe that'll be another podcast we'll do down the
Yeah,
road.
yeah.
Is talking about the book from 1842 with the Sobieski Stuarts and sort of
Yep.
their popularizing of the different tartans and maybe even making some tartans up. And I can't wait to talk about that and get your opinion on that. But with regards to those colors and those things, you mentioned people maybe writing in say, "Hey, add some brown to that." Do the colors produce anything? Is there any symbology to the colors that are in specific tartans? So I'm wearing Mackenzie.
Yeah, yeah.
Does the red mean?
Yeah. Historically, no. You so people would always wear what they liked, could afford, or was available. And the gentry, the top layer, would always have the best. The equivalent of the middle class would always aspire to be the better, and the poor would, do with whatever they could. Quite often that would be reused or whatever. Um, if you like, Gallic tradition, red was always an important color. It was a color that was greatly sought after. And so, yes, red or any other color was hugely important to the Gaels. Um, but in terms of symbology, there was historically no such thing. You see it often nowadays, and that again is part of the myth that you see. So I have been told that, for example, black in a tartan is a sign of mourning.
Ah,
Um,
sounds
you
right.
know, well, absolutely. That, yeah, but that's just not the case.
Correct.
I once had a weaver that's no longer in business, but I put a commission to them, and they said, "Oh no, we can't do it like that because we can't put black on the edge because that's very unlucky." Well, no, no, I'm the customer, and that's what I want. So nowadays, people will seem to think that, white means purity and blue will mean this and red's for the iron or the blood or something like that. These are modern romanticizations, if you like, but they have no basis in history. As I say, people would just buy what they liked or could afford. Red was the most expensive color because it was invariably an imported dye stuff. So when you look at portraits of the 18th, early 19th century, most of the and portraits are always of the well off, the better off, but most people are wearing predominantly red tartans because they're making a social statement.
Hmm,
Check me out, look at me, look how wealthy I am. I can afford lots of red. And
right.
it wasn't just Highland dress, European fashion at that time liked red, and it's indeed why cardinals still wear red because
Hmm,
it's back to that expensive color.
got it. So a lot of times, again, maybe going back a little bit further, even with regards to colors in tartans before that, why would
Mm.
they have been certain colors? What do we know about sort of the regions with regards to tartan? Would they, why
Well,
was,
again, okay, so there is another myth, which is that, traditionally there weren't clan tartans. People accept and they think, oh, there were district tartans, and each of the type of pattern or the colors were dependent on the district that it
yeah,
came from. There are very few geographically restricted dye plants that were traditionally used. So, there's not one area that just has red dyes and one that has blue dyes, etc. The dye stuffs, Scotland's a small country, and most of the traditional dye stuffs will grow almost anywhere. The possible exception to that are some of the lichen dyes that are only associated with the West Coast. So there's one called Cudbear, which gives a sort of maroony reddy color. And the other traditional one is a dye stuff called dark truffle, which gives a beautiful ginger color, fabulous smell as well.
hmm,
And that's what traditionally was used in Harris Tweed. So
interesting.
those are two dye stuffs that are fairly regionally specific. But again, if you look at tartans from those areas, old surviving pieces, they don't use those dye stuffs, they use imported things. So certainly by 1600, imported reds and imported blues were de rigueur because they were stronger, easier to use, etc.
Fascinating. Wow. That's great. So we have just time for one more topic today, and we'll talk a little bit about tartan and how it's sort of advertised to people today. Again, going back to the tartan I'm wearing, if I'm looking at the Mackenzie and I want to get a Mackenzie tartan, I'm going to see some options. I'm going to see modern, I'm going to see ancient, I'm going to see muted, weathered, whatever the titles might be. And
Yep.
what do those titles mean? What does that mean for people today?
Okay. So those titles have nothing to do with the antiquity of a pattern, for example. So the old Mackenzie is no older than the modern Mackenzie, which is no older in a sense than the weather Mackenzie. It's a terminology that refers to the color palette. That's all. So if we went back to pre-1856, there were only natural dyes. And the term natural dyes as opposed to vegetable dyes, because the principal source of red was an insect, so therefore not a vegetable. So natural dyes is a better term.
Hmm,
In 1856, the first chemical or artificial dye was invented, Perkins purple. And thereafter came a lot or quite quickly came a number of other ones. These dyes were quite harsh, quite bright, and in many cases quite dark as well. So you got those very sort of dark greens, dark blues, etc. So ironically, these first artificial dyes, which is what we would now call modern colors, are actually older than what we would now call ancient or old colors,
hmm,
confusingly. Those colors, the ancient old colors, came in and around about 1900, and were almost a sort of a look back to what people thought the quote original dyes looked like. The thing about all of these palettes is that they all have the same tonal value across all the colors. So in modern colors, you've got a bright or vivid dark red, dark green, dark blue, etc. Ancient or old colors, they're all a much more washed out orangey red, mid blue, mid green, etc. And these are quite different. All of these palettes are quite different from the way that the original natural dyes were used, where you would start with probably your more expensive dye, get the best colors you could from that, and then balance the other colors out around that, so that you'd have, if you like, counterbalance between the different colors. But as I say, we've now got old, ancient, old, ancient, old, ancient, modern, reproduction, weathered colors, and muted colors. Also, all of these are, as I say, modern commercial color palettes. They don't affect um, they don't make a different pattern, and they don't have any um, indication of the age of a tartan, other than, we can say that, as I say, modern colors start from about 1850, 1856, 1860 onwards, old colors from about 1900 onwards, reproduction colors were a 1947 concept from DC Dalgleish. Weathered colors coming in about the 1970s
Oh wow.
as an attempt to replicate reproduction colors, which were copyrighted.
Oh, were they?
Beauty colors come in sort of slightly later, and there are some more recent color palettes like antique colors you sometimes see as well. Some of these, I say, all of them are color ways. So they are shade differences, if you like. So there is no defined red, blue, or green. They're generic terms.
How often, or have you experienced where you've seen something that's maybe like created in our day, listed as ancient or something like that, and then compare it to something that actually is older, where it maybe was more weather damaged and things like that? Is it ever close? Is it ever close when you see something that's supposed to be
No,
sort of aged
no,
appropriately?
it's never close unless you do a proper color match. So I've done some reconstruction work with Loch Karen, where we have sat down with, taken an 18th century piece and actually color matched each of the individual colors.
Yeah,
That you can do. It takes a lot of time,
sure.
but you can do it and get almost a perfect color match and shade match, as I say. But if you just go to your stock yarn shades, then whether you use modern colors or weather colors or mix them up, you will get something that, yes, it's the same tartan, but it won't look the same.
Right. How
Yeah.
often do you get we're talking about myths and things like that that you come across. Are you hit with this a lot where people think that those colors mean something with regards to the age of the tartan? My
Yeah.
grandfather's kilt is this, it must be this old because it looks way more faded than the modern one that they sell at the shop.
Yeah. So that you've got two things there. One is, any ancient piece of cloth, faded piece of cloth, tends to have an antiquity assigned to it, irrespective of how old it is.
Yeah,
And so I've done some work with taking a piece of modern tartan and covering half of it up and putting the other half in the window for 2 years in
yeah,
direct sun. And I had, on one side, I had sort of muted colors because they were matched to Wilson's of Bannockburn shades. And on the other side, I had, quote, ancient colors, simply because they'd been faded for 2 years. So
sure.
you have that. You can understand how, even in the late 19th century, families being handed down something from perhaps 100 years before, or maybe early 1900s, to them, something that's old. And by that time, you're looking at 3 or 4 generations. Therefore, it must have been worn by Bonnie, Prince Charlie, whatever, because it's old. And old, and certainly, in late 1800s, meant that it must be 18th century or something like that. So you've got that. And then this is also further confused by particularly the term old, as in old colours, because people think that that's an indication of the age. And I did some work during my time with the Scottish Tartan Society, where we tried to get all the manufacturers to agree, no, it's like herding cats, to, to put any qualifying term, like, the color shade after the name, and anything that was about the antiquity before the name. So, for example, you've got a couple of McLaughlin tartans, one of which is called Old McLaughlin, and that denotes that that pattern predates the later McLaughlin. The fact that when it was first woven in and used in the early 1800s, it was just called McLaughlin's, neither here nor there. But that way it helps you then, if you like, separate out and put into a date order various patterns. But as I say, if you then have old, old Campbell or old MacDonald, people think, oh, well, this is the original of the old pattern. And you say, no, no, it's just a colorway. And people get very confused by that. Alas, we could not get the manufacturers to agree a uniform set of nomenclature simply because they'd all had their, brochures printed and they'd always used it this way round or that way round. The same as some will call them old colours and some will call them ancient colours. And you say they're the same thing.
Right. So there,
And
yeah,
one firm's ancient colours is not the same as someone else's ancient colours because, as I say, it is simply a lighter green, a lighter blue, a lighter red, and they all have their own house light red, light blue, light green, or dark red, dark blue, etc.
yeah, I think we should have a discussion about that too moving forward at some point, talking about the
Hmm.
different weavers and their sort of their processes and
Yep.
colorways and things like that, like you're mentioning. So certainly that's something we can get into down the road as this podcast continues. Tartan truths, we hope, will continue to be revealed. And we appreciate very much your time talking about some of these myths, some of these top myths that have confused so many people, but we're happy to get good, accurate information out there for people. And who better to explain it than Peter MacDonald along with us?
Very happy to share some of my research and thoughts, and I look forward to taking some of this forward.
Excellent. So we'll see you next time on Tartan Truths.